Okay, I'm here with Daphne Martschenko. Did I pronounce that right?
That's correct.
And she's going to introduce herself. We're going to have a conversation about behavior genetics, the genetic basis of cognitive ability. And since I often am asked questions similar to the ones that she's formulated for this interview, I thought it would be useful just to record it. And hopefully, if this doesn't come out too poorly, we'll post it up on YouTube and other people can then benefit from the conversation. So maybe Daphne's going to introduce herself and tell her she has a very impressive background, Stanford undergrad, and I think she's now at Oxford in graduate school. Am I right? Or Cambridge?
University of Cambridge, yeah.
Oh, Cambridge. Sorry. So this is part of her graduate work there, and so she'll explain.
Okay, so my name is Daphne Martschenko. I'm a first-year PhD student here at the University of Cambridge. The background I'm coming from, I went to the University of Stanford, where I completed an undergraduate degree in medical anthropology and Russian literature. A little bit of a side job there. But I am currently looking at genetics research on intelligence, and specifically within the context of the United States, looking at how this research could potentially impact the US education system. So specifically, I'm looking at ethnic minority and low socioeconomic income underrepresentation in gifted education programs, and kind of how this genetic research feeds into that conversation, or potentially could feed into that conversation.
Very good. And for people who, I don't know how this video will come out, but you'll notice I'm sucking on a cough drop, and it's because I have a kind of throat problem. I'm trying to not lose my voice. So I'm not that weird. I'm sucking on this cough drop for a reason. Okay, so why don't we just jump into your questions, which I thought were very well formulated, and I look forward to answering them.
Okay, thank you. My first question is kind of getting to know a little bit about your background. So specifically, what led you to enter the field of genetics research, focusing on cognitive ability? We'll start there.
So there are a couple threads to this. One is, so my field is theoretical physics, and there are a lot of cognitively special people in the field, and I've always wondered about what causes some people to be cognitively stronger than others. In fields which are really difficult, have difficult material or abstract material, you can see vast differences between capabilities of individuals, and so that sort of makes the whole thing more stark. And so I've been interested in that for some time, really since I was a kid. I've always been interested in evolution, genetics, DNA, and all that stuff. And I chose actually to go into physics and not into some area like molecular biology, because when I was younger, the technology was not very advanced. And a lot of what I thought were the interesting questions, which we're only starting now to get some traction on, were just clearly not going to be addressable 20 years ago with the existing, or 30 years ago with the existing capabilities. But I kind of kept my eye on the area. And so in the last 5-7 years, when I noticed sequencing costs were dropping like crazy, and in fact, the drop is super exponential. So it's actually faster than Moore's law. And when I noticed that was happening, from my experience with the internet and other technologies, I realized, wow, if this curve continues, a bunch of questions that are really interesting could get answered in my lifetime. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll start following more closely. And then I actually got involved in some research. And so that's how we got here.
And could you speak a little bit about the Cognitive Genome Lab? That's how I first kind of discovered you and really entered my interest in this field.
So I was going on sabbatical at a physics institute in Taiwan for a year. And I just happened to see an article about BGI and about all the sequencing power that they had. And I think maybe in the article even mentioned that they were going to pursue difficult problems like genomic basis for intelligence or something like this. So one other weird aspect about my background is that I was actually an internet startup founder in the Valley, and so I'm a little bit unusual. I'm willing to take risks and do crazy things. So I just wrote an email to the senior people at BGI, and I said, "Hey, I'm going to be in Taiwan for a year. It's like a short plane flight over to where you are. I've been thinking about this problem, and I can propose various study designs that would potentially yield interesting results. And they said, oh, sure, come over. And so I and a couple of other collaborators who are now actually pretty prominent people in the field went over to give a series of lectures to them. And that's how the whole thing got started. And it was just a kind of scientific entrepreneurial kind of thing. And I encourage, you seem like a very talented young student. I think always be willing to take risks and just try things. The reason something is not being done isn't necessarily because it's not a good idea, just because people maybe aren't willing to try things. So that's how it started.
And specifically, again, about BGI. So I noticed that the project started taking samples from Chinese population. And then with the help of Robert Plomin, you kind of expanded to get a more global perspective. I was looking at the standards for selecting individuals, particularly those in the US, and a lot of it was based on SAT, ACT, or GRE scores, or PhDs in STEM subjects from top-notch universities. Could you go into a little bit more depth about how BGI's procedures for selecting from, say, the Chinese population may have differed from once you expanded towards a more global population pool?
So these things sort of evolved, not in a little bit haphazardly. So what happened was the initial thought was it would be easiest to get samples from the Chinese population. And so we were looking at various ways to recruit intellectually gifted Chinese kids. There were some very young people at BGI who were part of the lab at the beginning, and they had come from a very elite high school in Beijing. So one of the first places they started looking was at this elite high school, and they had the cooperation of the principal. So they were testing kids there, and then we actually tried to make contact with the people who coach the math and physics and computer science Olympiad teams in China, because those kids are extremely bright. So there were some recruitments done in China, but we realized sort of that actually it was actually pretty tough going to get kids recruited in China. And in fact, the laws about whether you could take DNA samples from minors and things like that were not fully fleshed out. And so it was actually not, people get this idea that in China you could just snap your fingers and the government would order people to queue up and do stuff. And it's actually nothing like that at all. So then we had two parallel efforts which were based more in the West. One was Robert Plomin had access to DNA from a sample of kids who had scored well in something called the Study of Mathematically Precocious Youth, or maybe it was the Center for Talented Youth at Duke. But these are long-running longitudinal studies of gifted kids that have been identified in the US, going back, really some of the people in the study now are probably close to 60 years old now. So that's a population of very intellectually gifted people. And then the other thing I did was I went to various places like Google and Caltech and gave talks and just started recruiting people, just volunteers. And we had to have some threshold to figure out which volunteers we wanted to accept, because it's still quite expensive to do sequencing. And so we formulated some thresholds, which basically, roughly speaking, we thought that the pool of people who passed the threshold would be something like around 3 standard deviations above the average in terms of intellectual ability. So that would be kind of like at the 1 in 1,000 level. And I want to say that all of these tests, IQ tests, measurements of the thing called G, the psychometric quantity G, these are just crude measurements. And so for an individual to say, if you have two individuals and you say A scored higher than B, so A must be smarter than B, on an individual basis, there's a very good chance what I just said is incorrect, even though A scored higher than B. But when you take large numbers of people, so if you have 10,000 people who scored 30 points higher than another group of 10,000 people, then on average, the people in one group might be better than the other. And so what you're looking for when you do these genetic studies is statistical signal. So what you're doing is you're averaging over the many people in group A, and you're averaging over the many people in group B, and you're looking to see whether there's a systematic higher frequency of a particular gene variant in one group over the other. And that's a signal that maybe that has something to do with the way that you selected the two groups. And so, but I want to say the tests themselves are noisy. So people always, when they read something related to this area, or they watch some talk that I've given, they often say, oh, you're some kind of IQ fanatic or this or that. I actually think the tests are quite noisy, and they're only valid as statistical predictors. They're not actual they're not super reliable individual predictors. So let's just get that out of the way.
Awesome. And what, in your opinion, are some of the potential benefits for identifying alleles associated with cognitive ability? I've heard various offers put forward by different people. Some have talked about the role of perhaps being able to identify things associated with dementia or degenerative cognitive illnesses. There are some that also have talked about the idea of personalized education, which we'll get to later, but I'm wondering, from your personal perspective, what are some of the potential benefits for this kind of research?
Yeah, so, you got to remember, I'm a theoretical physicist, so let me start from the very, very abstract, very conceptual. So your brain is one of the most complex, is in a sense, the most complex object that we know about in the universe. Yet it's built from a very short genetic code. I could take your whole genetic code and I could compress it down to less than a gigabyte of information, significantly less than it actually. And yet somehow that in that blueprint or plan or program is something that constructs this really complex device. And we know that our brains are in some sense much better than monkey brains or much better than dog brains, but there are a relatively small number of tweaks that are made in the genetic code between us and them that cause us to have this much better brain. And so to me, going back, you were asking me what my sort of original interest in the subject was. I have wondered since I was a kid and I learned about DNA exactly how this works, exactly how that the genetic code can encode such a complex, amazing device. So that for me, that's the ultimate thing. This is a step along the way to answering really one of, let's put aside black holes and superstrings and stuff like that, but one of the most intellectually interesting problems that humans will ever attack. And so it's just a step in that way. Now, in more practical terms, when you identify variants that are associated with good or bad cognitive function, often the pathway, the biological or biochemical pathway that gene is influencing becomes, reveals some aspect of how the brain works, some aspect of neuroscience or some aspect of basic brain biochemistry. And so there are going to be enormous benefits from this kind of research for perhaps things like Alzheimer's and schizophrenia and dementia. So, I think if you really sat down and thought about it, you realize for the amount of money that it costs to do these studies, compared to the $10 or $15 billion that we spend on cutting edge high energy physics experiments like the Large Hadron Collider at CERN, this stuff is ridiculously cheap for what you get back. And so it's just kind of a no-brainer that humans should work on this problem. That's my view.
And so would you say that there are any disadvantages to conducting this research?
Yeah, part of the reason we're talking is because it's a sensitive topic. And it should be a sensitive topic because when, and I don't want to put all the blame on Europeans, but when in the recent history of colonialism and imperialism emanating mainly out of Europe, it was very easy for them to say, hey, the reason we're dominating these other people and exploiting these other people is because we're better than they are, we're smarter than they are, and we deserve to dominate them. So there's a whole intellectual terrain that's highly contested here, right? And so I understand that people are very sensitive about this topic. And bad science has been used in the past in the service of empire and exploitation. But it doesn't mean that, in the same way guns have been used and rockets and atomic bombs have been used for various purposes, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't develop those technologies. And so my view is sort of along those lines. I do want to say that your interests and my interests are slightly different in this topic because I'm not primarily interested in group differences. I do not devote any fraction of the time I do work on this stuff to the question of, hey, does one group have slightly, on average, better genes for cognitive ability than the other? That's not really a driving question for me. And I sincerely hope we live in a world where it isn't the case, where there aren't big group differences. My interest is really more the high end, like I was saying, because of my background in physics. I'm actually kind of interested in why, Newton or Einstein are so much smarter than I am. So that's sort of my interest. And it eventually gets back to an individual level thing, like how are these single individuals who made such, like Richard Feynman or something, who made such an important contribution to society. Exactly how are they wired up differently than I am or some person off the street? That's more my interest.
I'm really glad that you brought up the intellectual terrain, so to speak, because I watched the documentary DNA Dreams, which kind of mapped the early stages of the Cognitive Genome Lab. And it was really interesting for me because within watching that, I heard the term positive eugenics being used.
Yep.
And especially given the idea of bad science being used in service of the empire, it was really interesting to me that that specific word, the word eugenics, was used within a modern day context. Could you go into a little bit more detail about?
Yeah, it's worth unpacking that word a little bit because it goes. I don't know that exactly goes back to Galton, but it's an old word, and I think it comes from the Greek, which basically just means improve genes or something, or to make better genes or something. And of course, it was used in a terrible way, by the Nazis to try to eliminate entire groups of people because of their genetics or their ethnicity. But we use it every day in modern, liberal democracies. For example, people test when they're pregnant for Down syndrome. And no one would, I think, tell a pregnant potential mother that she would necessarily have to carry a child to term if, say, after a few weeks of pregnancy, she realized that it had Down syndrome. That's also eugenics because you're making a decision on the future of that potential human based on some genetic aspect. So it's a very complicated word. And so in certain parts of the academy, I would say, and the political spectrum, eugenics has taken on this extremely specific negative meaning. But it's very funny because the word actually, even as originally formulated by Galton, I think it was Galton, really applies to activities that are going on everywhere. And somewhere in this city right now, there's some woman taking a Down syndrome test, trisomy test. And that is eugenics as well. So when we talked about positive eugenics in that documentary, what we meant was in the future, and then this is science fiction right now, okay, this is not reality yet, although in vitro fertilization is a reality, and there are hundreds of thousands, approaching 1 million cycles of IVF, I think, done worldwide now every year. There are situations where you have to make embryo selection. So in a typical IVF cycle, it would not be uncommon to produce 10 or a dozen fertilized embryos. And of course, you're not going to implant all of them. And so the mother-to-be, the parents-to-be are making decisions about what to do with those embryos and which ones to implant. And inevitably, as the technology advances, they're going to first be able to say things like, well, the ones that have really severe disease conditions like Down syndrome, but there are many thousands of other inherited diseases, maybe we don't want to implant that one. Now, more speculatively, you could go forward and say, well, maybe in the far-flung future, you'll be able to say something like, well, this one is going to be a really good athlete, really good rower. Okay. Wow. Well, gee, maybe maybe we should implant that one. Or maybe not. But I think we're going to get into those delicate areas, difficult areas, simply because the technology is taking us there. And all of the things I just talked about are examples of eugenics. And I think everybody can have their own ethical or moral opinion about what's acceptable or what's not acceptable among the things that I described. Certainly, doing something against the will of another living human is something I'm against. So if someone says, hey, Steve, you got to report to this camp and we're going to gas you because we don't like your genes. Okay, well, that's definitely bad eugenics. But I would not get on a high horse and tell some woman in East Lansing that she cannot decide not to bring to term a baby, an embryo, because it has Down syndrome. I mean, that's another example of eugenics. And I personally think it's okay for her to make that personal decision.
Mm-hmm. And we've touched briefly on G, the term G, and I guess I interpret it to be a rather fixed sort of concept. So I wonder what your kind of interpretation of Carol Dweck's growth mindset argument would be in relation to, the concept of G.
Yeah. So this gets into, I think in our previous emails and setting up this call, we exchanged some ideas. And one of the things that really bugs me in general among not among the general public because they're not trained scientists, but in the academy, among people who are research scientists, I really don't like this I don't like the impact of this sort of magical thinking, wish fulfillment kind of mentality, which is that it's very tough to stay unbiased in your research, to try to just let the data speak for itself. And it's true even in physics. So there are physicists, you might think it's hard to get emotional about what quarks are doing, okay? But there are physicists who become wedded to a particular intuition they have about how some microphysics works. And they'll defend to the grave their model of quark interactions in nuclei. And that prevents rational advancement of the field because people get hung up on their specific thing. And when experimental evidence starts accumulating against their model, they cling to it much longer than they should, much longer than on the planet Vulcan, Spock and his friends would cling to the model. They would say, okay, that model's dead long before the typical human scientist who's not completely rational would give it up. Now, the general discussion about G and IQ and cognitive ability, I feel, is heavily slanted toward wish fulfillment. So there's very strong data saying that it's heritable. There's very strong data that it's difficult to change. But people don't like that conclusion. And so then they want to attack it. And of course, when you do small sample size studies or you have a very strong agenda in your research, it's easy to constantly produce a stream of papers which contradict perhaps what is the actual reality, but you feel happy because my study overturns this whole idea that there's such a thing called hardwired cognitive ability and that it's fairly stable, et cetera, et cetera. And so we have this constant back and forth in fields like psychology and related areas in which it seems like the science is not really advancing. You just have these camps, and they're very ideologically focused and driven in what they're trying to produce in the research. So I find that very frustrating. I'm an outsider to these areas. But I think the clearest statement I would make is that what we know from behavior genetic studies with very, very large samples now is that if you take a kid, well, let me take the classic example. So you take two identical twins, so they have the same genetic information, the same genetics, and they're, say, adopted into different families. And let's assume that both adoptive families are within a decent range of provide a pretty good environment for the two kids. Okay, not talking about cases of extreme deprivation, not talking about cases where the kids aren't allowed to go to school or go to a good school, not talking about cases where the kids don't have sufficient nutrition, not talking about a case where the kid is locked in a pine box, okay, and their eyes don't develop properly. Okay, those are all examples of extreme environmental intervention which could affect what I'm about to say. But within the range of what some researchers call humane outcomes, so that could mean like someone who's maybe slightly below the average in terms of social economic status in the U.S., all the way up to the top, the effect size from the environmental aspect to it is relatively small, and this has been measured in very, very large studies. So I think but what I just said to you, I think you could find hundreds of hundreds of behavior geneticists or psychologists who would just accept what I just said. Then you could find hundreds who are violently opposed to what I just said. And it's very frustrating because it seems like the field is not really making progress. And anytime anybody comes up with some study which opposes what I just said, it gets tremendous amount of press and it's in the papers, et cetera, et cetera. But you know what? It ain't science. That's really not how science works.
And you also touched briefly on my background is a little bit different from yours in terms of our interest specifically in the field of genetics research on intelligence.
Right.
But as you mentioned, I'm interested in kind of test score gap differences between ethnic minorities and white majority in the US system. A lot of different research has shown that even when socioeconomic status is accounted for, some say that a gap between the ethnic minority and the white majority persists. And I was wondering your interpretation of this phenomenon.
Well, so that's the question, right? Coming from your perspective, it's not the most important question coming from my perspective. I'm much more interested in, again, why Terrence Tao is much smarter than I am, or much smarter than the average person walking the streets, than I am about this group difference question. So let me just get that out of the way. My personal opinion about it is, I hope it's not true. I would much rather live in a world where there are not big group differences. Number two, I understand why it's a sensitive issue, because it was used in an instrumental way to oppress people for a long time. So I'm not blind to that. Number three, I am a scientist. So when I say things like, hey, the results of the studies, the data available to us do not allow us to make a high confidence, come to a high confidence conclusion about it. That's what I'm going to say. And so I've been attacked by just not because I'm not willing to categorically rule something out. I'm suddenly a racist, which I think is absurd. I think for many questions like, is there a God? Okay, which you might admit that's even a more important question than are there group differences, or why is Einstein so smart? I would say the jury's out. I don't know if there's a God, right? And I don't think I should be labeled a bad human for just saying, hey, as a scientist, I don't quite know. Maybe I hope there is one, actually, for my sake and the sake of my children's souls. But I don't know the answer. And so it's just a very complex question. The scores are, as you say, you do the tests, you find differences. However, there are differences in average environment that these people experience. And so the really difficult statistical question is it the different environments that are causing the different scores on average, or is it genes? And it's a very difficult question. And I think it's one, for the earlier reasons that I cited, it's not one we should jump to conclusions on. We should be very, very calm on this one and wait until we have really, really good evidence before we start talking about, social policy or things like this. We should just be we should be like Spock. Okay, we should just put aside our emotions, be very, very careful, realize that these things have real world consequences, and wait until our certainty is at an extremely high level. The analogy that I would like to make, which I sometimes make, is that when the Large Hadron Collider announced the discovery of the Higgs boson a few years ago, the level of statistical certainty that was demanded and is demanded in my field is something like 5 or 6 standard deviations. And that's very different from the 95% confidence level that lets you publish papers in psychology. So it's sort of like, instead of 95% confidence level in physics to really publish the result, you need 99.99999% confidence level. Before that, even though you have some kind of little bump in the data that may ultimately turn out to be the Higgs boson, most physicists would say, we do not know whether that's the Higgs boson. It could be the Higgs boson, but until we get to 5 or 6 sigma certainty, I'm not going to say it's the Higgs boson. And I think that is the correct way that scientists should do their work. When they don't know, they should just say, I don't know. And so does that help answer your question?
Yes. Yeah. And you touching on the idea of environment. So we know that environment can inhibit potential. I mean, you gave examples of very extreme situations, but I wonder whether G estimates for ethnic minorities, particularly African Americans in the United States, who are more likely to find themselves in adverse socioeconomic conditions, who've had the legacy of slavery, say. I also recognize that this process takes a very long time. But I wonder if the fact that environment can inhibit the realization of potential, if this could then play into the findings we see in genetics research into intelligence. And you touched briefly on, could this be a reflection, some of these other studies, could this be a reflection of systems, environmental systems? So I wonder, I suppose, the same thing in reference to genetics on intelligence.
I think we have to be extremely careful. And the gold standard study on any complex trait, whether it's genetics or height or BMI or blood lipid levels, the best kind of study is to find a fairly homogeneous group of people who have been subjected to very similar environments growing up. And then to look statistically at, hey, the guys who are taller, do they have slightly different, or do they have different distributions of genes than the ones that are shorter? And in that way, you're minimizing the potential confounds. It could be that what you're detecting is some group of kids didn't get as much milk growing up as another group, and you mistake that for a genetic cause. And if you do a mixed study where you have different population groups, that's in the genetics terminology, that's called population structure. If you have population structure in your sample, you have to be extremely careful that what you're getting out isn't a consequence of that population structure. So everybody's trying to be extremely careful about this. And, ultimately at any given time, again, like even the results that are in the published today and that everybody believes, it could turn out in the fullness of time that some really tricky little statistical error is causing a problem. And so I would just say that's something that people in the field are aware of this. And as I said, the gold standard is to study one homogeneous population by itself. People would jump for joy if they could just get a hold of a data set like that and not have any contamination from other ethnicities or other environmental backgrounds in the population. Does that help?
Yeah, and research on intelligence on African American Hispanic populations has been more difficult because of the variability that is found within these very populations.
Yep.
And the SSGAC study on educational attainment specifically looks at individuals who are of European ancestry. So it's an attempt to, narrow down the population pool to a more homogeneous state. I wonder whether finding alleles potentially associated with G could in this case be ancestry specific.
So this is a very interesting question. And the general question of let's suppose I detect an allele, a particular gene variant that tends to make someone a little bit taller than someone who doesn't have the variant. And there are now thousands of such variants known. Or maybe on average increases blood lipid levels a little bit. Typically those are found in homogeneous populations. So I have some, ideally, I have some group of white people in Utah that I'm studying or something, or all Dutch people who are of European heritage or something. I detect the allele, and then one question people have immediately is, gee, I want to try on my sample. I've got a sample of a bunch of people from Beijing. And I want to see, in my sample of Beijingers, do the ones who have the plus variant also have slightly higher lipid levels than the Beijingers who have the minus variant? So this has been studied actually pretty deeply in GWAS over the last 5 years. And the interesting thing is, in most cases, the effect size and the sign of the effect is highly correlated across populations. So in other words, a plus allele in the Dutch population generally turns out to be a plus allele, basically doing the same thing in the Beijing population. And it isn't always the case. So there could be one variant that mysteriously, even has an opposite sign in a different population. But by and large, the results replicate across ethnicities. Now, will that turn out to continue to be the case for cognitive ability? I don't know, but it'll be an interesting thing. It'll be something that researchers are interested in testing right away once the particular variants are known.
So I watched the roundtable discussion that you were part of in New York on Genius, and some of the other researchers that I've had the opportunity to talk to have expressed a certain concern that perhaps genetically engineering individuals with a high G capability would introduce some issues that are perhaps more in popular culture are thought to be associated with that. So for example, mental illness or lower socio-emotional issues. And so I wonder whether you see a need to establish whether an increase in G would affect these other areas before we allow human genetic engineering of intelligence to become a reality. There's an argument that perhaps selecting for a certain feature is going to necessarily select against something else.
Right. So kind of a complicated question. Before I answer it, let me just emphasize we are quite far away from, in terms of technological capability, from being able to do any of these things. And the basic science has to be done before you could even think about such things. Now, there's a popular perception that there's a negative correlation between being bright and, for example, having good EQ. So there's a popular perception that having high IQ means you have low EQ. Okay, that may not actually even be true, but let's suppose it's true. Okay, and let's suppose that having high G predisposes slightly towards schizophrenia, something like that, okay? But these are highly polygenic conditions, highly polygenic traits, so they're influenced, controlled probably by thousands of genes. If in fact you know of examples where there's someone with a high IQ and a high EQ, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, perhaps, these are people who are clearly smart and clearly have some people skills, okay? And they're probably not, well, maybe they are, maybe all politicians are secretly sociopaths or something, but I think I know people who, sure, I know plenty of really geeky, aspy theoretical physicists, but I know some theoretical physicists like Brian Greene who have very warm, nice personalities, and they could probably sell used cars if they had to. So there are clearly combinations of alleles which don't necessarily have this problem. The question is, can you, to use a very mathematical kind of analogy, can you navigate in this as you genetically engineer the species, can you navigate in this very high dimensional space and get, for example, only gains and no, only benefits and no costs, or maybe benefits which vastly outweigh the costs? And this is a question for future research. We don't know the answer, but I certainly know examples of people. For some reason, I thought you were at Oxford and on a Rhodes, but I mean, you know, the stereotype of a Rhodes Scholar is somebody who was extremely good as a student academically, and maybe was even like on an NCAA sports team. And well, those people exist, right? So there clearly don't have to be trade-offs, right? So if you were thinking into the future, if you were a genetic engineer, your job would be to help this couple find a combination of their genes, or maybe with some slight edits, that gives them a really good outcome, a kid who can be a Rhodes Scholar. And maybe they don't want a geeky math genius, and maybe they don't want a hulking jock who can't do algebra. But clearly such examples exist. So we have existence proofs. There's a technical question of how possible it will be.
And behavior genetics research is conducted on a population level, but often I find that extrapolations are made at the level of the individual. And so, for example, Dr. Catherine Asbury and Robert Plomin have discussed the possibility of personalized education, the idea being that a child's genetic makeup could be used to establish targeted approaches towards most effective pedagogical practices. If my understanding is correct, educational attainment is predicted by IQ or G, and also obviously a wide array of other factors, including, for example, motivation. As we know, on an individual level, at times, teacher expectancy or stereotype threat can play a role in student motivation and ultimately how they achieve in the classroom. And as we mentioned before, we also know that environment can prohibit someone from reaching their full potential. So how beneficial or perhaps how reliable is it to apply population level findings to something like personalized education, which is very much individual focused?
I think that's a very aspirational goal on the part of Catherine and Professor Plomin. So I think it'll be quite difficult to do what they're describing. You could imagine an analogous thing, which is that imagine that you have a kid my kids are 10, I have twins. Imagine that you give them a genetic test and you say, hey, this kid is going to be a swimmer, or this kid is going to be a soccer player. You know, my response is, really? You know, like, wouldn't I just be better off working them out? Like, I bring them to the field and watch them run, watch their hand-eye coordination, watch their endurance. Aren't there direct measurements I could make, which are probably, as good or better than anything I could get from the genetics? So I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's a very ambitious kind of thing to try to do. I personally think that the more near-term application of genetic prediction will be specifically in the case where people are undergoing something like IVF. So if you specifically have a situation where, for fertility reasons, someone has produced 10 embryos, and that's just, they do that in order to get, increase the chances that they get a good one. And nowadays, I don't know if you knew this, but you can freeze fertilized embryos in liquid nitrogen, and there doesn't seem to be any negative effects from it. Amazing what little machine cells are. So you end up overproducing these embryos, and then you need to make a decision. And at that point, the only information you basically have is the genetic information. Maybe you can see more morphologically which bundles of cells look better than the other. That's basically all they have right now to go on. But in a few years, you'll have genetic information. And there you might make a choice. You might say, hey, this one looks like it's got better health prospects than that one. Or, at that level, I could imagine these kinds of decisions being made. But for people who are already born, and you could give them a test, you could give them a test of running speed, you could give them a test of algebraic calculation speed. It seems like you could measure their cognitive profile and even maybe their motivational profile better directly than to do it through the genes. But who knows?
I'm pretty in-depth. And there was one post that really popped out to me when you talked about living in magical thinking and understanding which truths are true. Could you go into more detail about this, perhaps specifically as it could relate to genetics research on intelligence or the concept of G?
Well, I think, okay, so there are two very, are you still able to hear me? Because your video is coming in and out.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh.
I think there are two key bundles of concepts that people, because of magical thinking, object to, but probably are pretty well supported by the evidence now. One is just that there is something called cognitive ability, and we can kind of crudely measure it. So, if a mom gets a test score back for her kid and it says, hey, my son is having trouble in math, generally most people accept that, okay, my kid really does need some help with math. And the question then is like, well, is there some kind of more stable characterization of the cognitive ability of the kid that can be made? And again, it's a noisy measurement, but I believe that at some level differentiation can be made. So the kids, for example, the kids who maybe in the future in their lives have a chance of becoming theoretical physicists, I think you could pretty easily identify a lot of those kids when they're young because they tend to be able to just do things cognitively that other kids their age cannot do. So there is some kind of stable thing within a good range of environments that one could measure about a person, but there's still a lot of resistance even to that idea. So a lot of people just say, hey, the SAT is just a measurement of your socioeconomic class. But that's very strange because everybody knows a family where the two brothers have the same socioeconomic class, but one brother is much smarter than the other brother, and everybody knows which one it is, right? So it's not fully a consequence of SES when you can see huge differences in a family, right? So anyway, but even that is resisted, I think, now that people don't want to believe that we can, in some crude way, figure out which kids are more likely to be able to do electrical engineering and which kids are less likely to be able to do electrical engineering. So that's one thing that's resisted because of magical thinking. And the other one is, well, given that there is this quantity that we can kind of crudely evaluate in people, what causes it? What controls it? And so the next stage is, well, a lot of people resist the idea that it could be genes that are influencing it. And no one's saying that genes control all of the variation, but at least a big chunk is controlled by genes. But even that statement is resisted by a lot of people. So I just find that very frustrating. And you might say, oh, it's only newspaper articles and magazine articles where this sort of crazy magical thinking and scientifically wrong perspective is promulgated. But I'm in the academy and I meet professors all the time who will argue the wrong, what I consider the wrong sides of both of those issues in an academic setting. So that's the state of the world.
My next set of questions are more ethics based. So you've written that each society will decide for itself where to draw the line on human genetic engineering. And of course, you can expect a diversity of perspectives. Some countries will be quick to allow this sort of technology to take root, but the issue potentially is that it will be most accessible to global elites if, some countries allow it and others don't. And so there's a need to give serious attention, as you say, in what may be a relatively short interval before these capabilities become a reality, as the chance of increasing inequity gaps could become a very realistic possibility. So my first question is, what stance do you presently see the US taking on human genetic engineering?
It's hard to know what the US stance will be because the general level of awareness is just extremely low in the general population and among politicians. Although it's kind of funny because anybody who's watched science fiction has been introduced to all these ideas going back, as far as you can, go. I mean, the early Star Trek series had a whole storyline with this guy Khan, who was genetically engineered and stuff. But in general, most people are not following it. So it's a little bit hard to know how it's going to go in the States. I do predict that just like the world can't come to an agreement on an important issue like climate change, the world will not come to a universal agreement on what to do about genetic technologies. Generally, the Asian countries, I think, tend to be less alarmed by eugenics because they don't have a recent history of, bad history that like we have in the West. And so I think there are going to be a lot of Asian countries that make this, legal within certain, range. And then if you're Bill Gates or Melissa Meyer, the CEO of Yahoo, if you want to, have the healthiest possible pregnancy and make sure your kids have 0 genetic diseases and maybe even pick the embryo that is going to be the smartest or the healthiest, you can just fly to Singapore and do it probably. So I think that if I had to predict the future, I would predict that there will be countries where this technology is available. People who are wealthy will be able to take advantage of it. I think it was reported, so I can say this, it was reported that what's his name? The co-founder of Netscape, Mark Andreessen, whose wife is also a very high-powered individual. I think it was reported that they not only went through IVF, they even had a host mother carry the child to term. So the wife didn't even carry the child, didn't endure a pregnancy. So you can see what options the rich have, which other people don't have. And so I think it's going to go that way. And then I think eventually what will happen is in progressive societies like America, and you're already starting to see this in the Scandinavian countries, they're just going to make it part of their healthcare system. So they're going to say, look, if you want to avail yourself of this different way of reproducing, which arguably could be healthy, at least certainly in the ability to eliminate disease conditions, it is better. We'll make it free. We'll make it part of your healthcare system. And so we could have a strange situation where some countries make it absolutely illegal, and then some countries make it free because it just makes sense. It actually, if you do the calculations, it actually saves huge amounts of money in the healthcare system.
And do you have any concerns with that realistic possibility, or the idea that some countries would make it completely illegal and others wouldn't, in terms of, the development of the human?
I guess being somebody who I guess has thought a lot about these issues, if you said, hey, Steve, we're having a referendum in the United States and everybody's voting on whether it should become legal, I would probably vote that it should be legal, but of course regulated, in the way that all the other medical procedures are regulated for the benefit of the patient. So I would vote yes. I think that properly supervised, this is a plus for humanity. I'm very nearsighted, and wouldn't it be great if the genes that are causing me to have to wear these glasses, my kids didn't have to deal with that. There are certain things which I think everybody could agree. Oh, wouldn't it be great if there was no more diabetes? So there are certain things I think that are just obviously good. And the things that are really tricky, like letting people supercharge their brain power, I think those should be carefully studied before they are made legal. But I think we'll probably go through a Wild West period before we get to that stage.
Mm-hmm. I've experienced the mindset among some researchers that the work that they produce should be left up to others for policy interpretation. Given the contested nature of intelligence, specifically in the US, do you think behavioral geneticists who are engaged with this work should also be engaged in discussion surrounding policy, or should that be left out of their hands, so to speak?
I think scientists, it depends on the individual. So I know plenty of scientists, maybe because they're Aspie or whatever, they just want to go in the lab and discover some really crystalline abstract truth about the universe. And they don't want to be bothered talking to some stupid congressman or judge or, or ethicist. And if that's what they want to do, great, let them do it because they're trying to do something good for human knowledge, et cetera. there are other people who I think are naturally suited to get involved in policy work or outreach work to educate the general population or even other areas of the academy about what's going on. And I think that's important too. I think we need all kinds of activities. I think what you're doing is really important. So I think what we have here in the field of genomics is a field that's moving at an incredible pace. It's making incredible discoveries on very short timescales. And the rest of the academy, if you're busy doing your own thing, you're not going to be able to follow what's happening. And so somebody who's smart and insightful and knows about all the historical and cultural baggage that you know about in this context can summarize it and write about it in a clear and balanced way so that people can come to their own conclusions. I think it's incredibly important because I think ideally society should make democratic decisions about what to do with these technologies, but they can't do it without good information.
Thank you so much for your time and for speaking with me. Those are my main questions. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think what I just said is maybe a good way to sum it up. I really encourage you to continue working on this, and I think it's actually going to become a bigger and bigger issue. It's so weird when you go on the internet, because in some quarters you have people saying this stuff is science fiction, it'll never happen, or it's impossible, or intelligence is not controlled by genes, so how could you possibly genetically engineer it? So you have opinions like that. And then you have people who are speculating about exactly what these genetic supermen are going to be like, or, well, sure, you can get really smart ones, but they'll all have Asperger's. And, so it's just the range of beliefs in this area that you can access just by doing a Google search is just extreme. Mm-hmm. We don't have people who say like, oh, you could never build a hydrogen bomb. I don't believe that exists. Everybody agrees. Yeah, you can build a hydrogen bomb. And now we can get down to the really nitty gritty of, how we can control this technology. Mm-hmm. So anyway, so I think what you're doing is important, and I'm glad we had this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.